All right, so this is going to be our last lecture. What we're going to do is work our way through the rest of the reptiles. We only have one. I left this one off. I wish I could be clever and say I left this one off, thinking I would segue into today's lecture, but I didn't. I left it off because I just totally forgot about it the other day. But when I pulled up my slides today and noticed that, I thought, well, actually, it is a pretty good segue. The last reptile, the last typical what you think of reptile until of course the new evidence and the new inclusion of birds in with the reptiles. Remember, I've talked about that a million times. But the last member of that group, the crocodilians, look very traditionally reptile. You know, they've got the scales and they've got the, you know, all the body, not the dry. Come on, Steve. Not the moist skin of the amphibians, but the dry skin of the reptiles and the warty skin and the big teeth and the, you know, they're all lizard-ish, snake-ish. You know, everybody has sort of an idea of what a reptile is. I mean, I guess every once in a while people kind of confuse amphibians and reptiles, those who don't know, but indeed we know kind of what a reptile. And crocodilians fit that bill, right? There's only a couple dozen species of crocodilians. There were probably a lot more, but they're one of those that really seem to get pounded heavily by human beings moving in and stuff like that. For one thing, being hunted. A lot of times big predators get hunted because of humans for no other reason than they're afraid of them, you know. And if you look at that dude standing on the beach next to that one, I can't remember. I should remember when I get these pictures and I find them online, but I'm sure that must be Australian. You know, one of the saltwater crocodiles that lives down there. These things get massive in size. They are very carnivorous reptiles. They have all of the characteristics you would expect of a critter that lives in an aquatic lifestyle. And what I mean by that is, like, you're going to have your eyes and your nose. Hi, Philip. Are going to be positioned, you know, way up on your head or as far up on your head as you can so you can sink. You've seen them. I know you have, yeah. How are you today? If you've been out on the water, you know you've seen gators with the nose and just the eyes sticking above the head, right? And if you lived in Florida long enough, you can look across a nice flat lake, right? And like when I come across Lake Jessup going to school in the morning, if I have enough light, I can look across there and I can see an alligator, and I can tell that way out there, that little bump that just looks like a bump, you know what those are. Those are just the head of that little gator laying down below, right? Very good for being one of those kind of predators that's really aggressive, quick, sharp teeth, boom, you're gone, right? So these are incredibly well adapted animals to doing what they do, which is hunt. But again, I go back to the idea that they look very reptilian-like. Yet, honestly, when we look at them along the evolutionary trail, when we look at certain characteristics about them, for example, that there's a lot of crocodilian alligator observations of them taking care of their nests, of maternal care, of protecting their nests. I actually found a nest of young alligators one time when I was, well, I did, and a bunch of us in grad school. We were out on a field trip. Oh, the little econ or something like that, and we found a nest of a bunch of these little gators like this one up here. What's the striping for? Do you know? The horizontal, vertical. What's the vertical striping on the small alligator for? That's right. Yep, because the mother builds the nest up into the grass and the weeds and stuff, and that kind of provide. It's like the tiger moving through the woods. Moving through the high grass, and how that provides a sort of a camouflage or a visual effect, if you will. And the four-chambered heart. We talked about what's happening with the heart. The fish have two-chambered. The amphibians have three-chambered. And again, let's understand it. And I'm not going to belabor that. I'm not going to say it again. But you understand what I mean? That's working really well for them. So there's nothing we can judge about that. But if you want to go up in metabolic rate, if you want to have a higher metabolic rate, if you want to be more efficient, if you want to be warm-blooded, for example, if you want to do something that takes an awful lot of physical activity, like flying, for example, Or if you're among the reptile types, if you're a crocodilian, you also have a 4-chambered heart. All right, so that's what I mean by this segue today. Even though I'm finishing up with reptiles, I'm actually talking about something that most herpetologists, folks who study these things, would actually consider more bird-like than reptilian. So again, we go back to Aristotle and that very first day back in, when did we start? August? Yeah. That very first day back in August when we talked about the rungs of the ladder. It's not that way. Here's an animal that, my goodness, for all intents and purposes, looking at everybody would say, do you think it's more bird-like or more traditional reptilian-like, whatever that would mean? And the answer would be obvious, but it's not, right? It's all those changes. Now, I put a few interesting pictures on here to show you some things. For example, we have 2 species of alligators here. We have 2 species of alligators, excuse me. We have one in the United States, interestingly enough, called Alligator mississippiensis. That's the genus and species. Many times species names come from where someone first may have described where they found these animals. Some scientist found them saw them in the Mississippi River. That one that you see climbing over a 4-foot chain link fence is one here in Florida. They've been known to climb fences, so they're pretty agile, especially when they're out running around during the season when they're moving between water holes looking for mates. There's not a whole lot, that really keeps them away from that kind of thing. What I meant to say, we have 2 of here in Florida, is we have 2 crocodilians. We have the alligator, which everybody's familiar with, but we also have the American crocodile, Crocodilus acutus. And it's always that idea of how do you tell them apart? Well, to me, there's a couple of things. If you look at the snout of the croc, it's, to me, more pointed. And the snout of the alligator is more rounded. So in one of those things where you remember something by remembering the reverse, I think alligator does not have the A-pointed snout. That's the crocodile. Now, folks who are a little more learned than I, or a little more into herpetology, up above, there's another way. When the mouth is closed, and to me, the problem with that is I don't often see the animal in this position. I see it in that position right here, actually, which is a picture I took when Cooper and I were out in the woods one time. The crocodile's teeth are more exposed, they're more obvious. And there's where I put that little red arrow, apparently among crocodiles, and again, I haven't seen enough of them to say this for myself, but there's one of the teeth up front that actually points overlaps the other way, if you can see what I mean, where alligators don't have that. They don't have the real prominent, jaggedy jaw, and they don't have that one weird tooth pointing the other way. I venture to say I've never seen a crocodile here in Florida. Many of them, I think, actually, they are down in South Florida for the most part. But and I don't know anything about the relative comparison between aggressiveness between them. I know in general crocodiles can be more aggressive than alligators. Alligators can be pretty doggone aggressive, although it usually is one of those things like sharks. Oftentimes it's a mistaken type of thing, right? They attack something out of you get too close to them or something like that, or they mistake you for prey. All right, so sticking still in with the reptiles. Let's be true to the new science, relatively new science. Let's go on with the birds, okay? What's really kind of interesting, first sort of strange fact about the birds, a lot of strange facts about the birds. What a bizarre adapted organism. What a bizarre result of adaptation. There you go, Steve, get that out. What an incredibly well-crafted type of critter, okay? But we have the ornithischian dinosaurs and the saurischian dinosaurs. The ornithischian dinosaurs are the ones that are what generally are called bird-hipped, because of the way their hips are. These are the bipedal versions of the dinosaurs, right? Now, sometimes people mistakenly think, birds are relatives of ornithischian dinosaurs. Too many damn vowels in that word. But this right here, ornith, means bird. Someone who's an ornithologist, that's what they study. So it's a little bit confusing here because birds are actually like the other type of dinosaurs, the Saurischian, a word I don't have any problem saying. It's got to be that ornithischian, some kind of something in there. Anyway, the Saurischian dinosaurs, that's Tyrannosaurus. That's those guys, okay? So among the dinosaurs, there are the bird-hipped ones, in which the birds did not come from, and the ones that had a slightly different kind of hip from which the birds are more closely related to, if that doesn't make it any more confusing. Notice what they're calling dinosaurs, too. Things that we sometimes thought of as dinosaurs, like the flying things, aren't truly dinosaurs. They're archosaurs. Remember that word from us doing our cladograms a long time ago, right? We talked about the archosaurs. But the dinosaurs truly are only the bird-hipped ones, the Saurischian ones, and now you can tell everybody, of course, the dinosaurs, like I said, they never went extinct, right? They're still there. The plesiosaurs and the ichthyosaurs are all dinosaur-era reptiles, but again, not in the classification of what we call dinosaurs, okay? So that makes sense. Let's go on to birds. Birds are so weird. I mean, all right, we got the four-chambered heart. I said, no, I don't want to repeat things, so let's kind of stick with the slide. All right, very diverse, 10,000 species, still a lot of reptilian traits, and I got some pictures of some. For example, an amniotic egg. All right, well, we do too, right? We have an amnion around our fetus. Remember, that changed from the amphibians to the reptiles. Scales on the legs. Look at the legs of a chicken or bird. They have scales, which is a remnant of the scales on reptiles. A big difference, though, among birds, there are no teeth and there's no tail. There are tail feathers, but there's no tail, and there are no teeth. Waterfowl, ducks and such have a serrated bill sometimes. The bill is serrated, but it's not teeth. It's not like we learned when we looked at the dissection of the shark. We all know it's about the feathers. We talked about the feathers. That's the key to their success. That's the key to birds being birds. Indeed, that's what really makes birds, right? Is really that whole thing that started out as something very different, that exaptation, right? It was used for warmth initially. We talked about that in evolution, how, and you're going to see as I talk about particular reptiles, bird-like reptiles, you're going to notice that when the first feathers evolved, and I'll talk about this again when I get to it, the first feathers were flightless feathers. They did not have the aerodynamics. You see, the aerodynamics of a bird is like the way anything flies. Whatever structure you use, a wing of a plane or feathers, what you basically do is you create negative pressure above you. It's not so much, although it's a technicality, pushing the air down below you when the bird flaps its wings, or not so much that the wing of a plane pushes the air down below it like you might do with your hand out the window. It's really more about the vacuum that's created above it by the design of the wing or the way the bird flaps its wing. I saw a really cool story on TV one time about how sailboats work. So that's how you can sail against the wind. You can tack. I don't know. I've never done much sailing, but you tack because what you do is you basically create a vacuum. You create a void, a negative pressure area in front of the sail, and the sailboat kind of falls into it. You do that by cleverly putting the sail. It's fascinating. But the first feathers couldn't do that, right? They had to be what we call asymmetrical feathers. See that feather on the right-hand side? The barbs and the barbules and the hooks, those are all really good things for holding those, oh gosh, what the heck are those little things called? It's the shaft and the dumaflaches that stick out the side, right? It's a good thing for holding them together. It's also very good for holding them together on the downstroke and yet giving on the upstroke. Downstroke together, giving on the upstroke, right? For reasons that are obvious. It's easier to move it up against the air as you go to push down again on the power stroke. But if you notice, that feather is actually asymmetrical. It's thicker on one side of the main shaft than it is on the other. That's what we call an asymmetrical feather. First feathers that evolved were symmetrical. Down below, if you look down in here in the lower left, this is sort of a graphic. Let's go back in history and see where feathers came from. So in stage one, we have a projection that's growing out of the skin of a critter. Now, let me stop right there for a second. I'm going to come back because I want to kind of just shoot off of that. Look at these pictures over here on the right-hand side. So here's where a feather comes from. Organisms, reptiles, have dermal condensations. They have scale placoids. That's what makes the big, heavy things that they call scutes or scales, or even on your snake, right, Sean? Where those came from are placoids, and placoids are what it says, dermal condensations, collections of skin tissue. And sometimes what those placoids do is they grow and they change and they evolve and they develop and they become different kinds of scales. The scales on fish, the scales on snakes, the scales on reptiles. The fur, listen, fur-like stuff that's on little baby chicks. See that one in the picture? Doesn't that look like fur? Looks like hair, doesn't it? In a little baby chick, that doesn't look like feathers, okay? And those things that make scales and scutes, those dermal condensation, those placoids, like you see in the picture on the right, can make this projective thing that sticks up, okay? Now, this projective thing that sticks up, we're back to stage 1, the lower left, might end up being hair, right? So a reptilian dermal condensation, a placoid, in one instance, and I'm foreshadowing a little bit here because we're not to them, but gave rise to mammalian hair, which looks an awful like, oh, got myself excited, an awful lot like the yellow stuff that you see on a baby chick. Or looks what's happening now in stage 1, stage 2, it branches, stage 3, it does that, stage 4, stage 5, you see what I'm getting? Now notice between stage 4 and stage 5, symmetrical, asymmetrical. Right, so there's where we go, and that's why when we look in the fossil record and we find these reptiles with feathers and we go, could they fly yet? We know something about physics. We know something about physics that applied to back then as well as now, that you cannot fly with a symmetrical feather. You've got to have an asymmetrical feather. There are other things about that. Isn't that cool? Birds figured that out. I love watching them at the beach and watching them fly. I'm like, man, you understand all these incredible things that many of us just spend years and hours in the air to learn. Love to be a bird. All right, how about flight? Let's talk about the things that help you fly. Well, for one thing, you're going to stay light. You don't have a urinary bladder. They just pee. All right, so that's where how do they work? Well, they don't store it. Our urinary bladder doesn't make our urine. The only thing it does is it makes our urination convenient. You just don't want to be walking around going, oh, there I am, Fred. Just peed again. Well, if you're a bird, I guess you don't care. You just rain down in front of everybody. We're all over everybody. Females are going to limit themselves to one ovary. Now, is that bad or good? Well, it depends on how you look at it. It's bad if that one ovary is bad. You don't have another one that's good, but it's good if that one ovary is good because you ain't going to lug that other one around, right? See what I mean? Your gonads get small when you're not breeding, and they get really big when you are breeding. And if you're a male one, because they get big, you go, whoa, and you start singing, and you go, I got really big ones, really big gonads. I wonder if that's what they're saying. And all the females go, he does, and he's very pretty, and look at the nest he built. And everybody knows all that. The hormones that make your gonads get big make you want to sing. It's spring fever in the birds. It happens the same thing to us. Okay, now, one of my favorite things to talk about. Do you know why they used to bring a canary, like that picture of that dude up top there, into a coal mine? That's a canary in a cage. Does anybody know why? The police sang about it, canary in a coal mine. And it's a thing they used to do. Does anybody know why? Philip or Sean? Have you ever heard that before? My kids always do that. I'll tell them something. They'll go, well, Dad, we've never. I'm like, really? Yes, right? Because they're more sensitive to changes in air quality. And that could be carbon monoxide levels, and high carbon monoxide levels, you know, are poisonous. It's toxic, right? Even high carbon dioxide levels, high levels of methane. Methane is poisonous to humans. It also explodes. You want to get the heck out of there. So what Philip said was exactly right. Birds are more sensitive breathers. Now, let me tell you why that is. If you're going to be a big flying thing, or even a small flying, if you're going to fly and you're going to have this really high metabolic rate, you're going to make yourself really efficient. So you're going to design, evolutionary is going to design these adaptations that are like superchargers on cars. And one of the things that she's done is this really efficient respiratory and this really efficient circulatory system that we find in birds. First of all, the circulatory system, it's easy. It's a four-chambered heart. Four-chambered heart is going to increase the blood pressure that flows through the rest of the body. You're not mixing the blood, allowing you to have a higher metabolic rate, allowing you to get bigger, right? One of the things that these warm-blooded critters can also get away with, especially some species like hummingbirds, is jacking up that heart rate, man. 1,260 beats per minute in a hummingbird, right? That's why those things can hover. Ours is, 70? Higher metabolic temperatures, even higher than ours, 40 to 42 degrees, right? So you got all this, that you're all supercharged. But let's go back to what is going to drive all that. If you remember from Bio 1, in order to have a really high metabolic rate, you need fuel, don't you? Yeah, not really fuel. You need oxygen. You understand, right? You remember what oxygen does for respiration. It's the final electron acceptor. Electron's got to have that place to go. If you don't have oxygen, you go anaerobic, and you only get 2. You remember all this, right? You all are with me on that? So it's oxygen. The more oxygen you can draw per breath, the higher up you can jack your metabolic rate. Now, look at the schematic. Well, let's look at the bird in the upper right first, blue jay. Notice that there are the lungs, right? Okay. But there's things called air sacs. Now, lungs are just a fancy name for an air sac. A fancy air sac, don't get me wrong. I told you before that anything that's highly vascularized, has a lot of really thin sort of blood vessels running through some tissue, gases can go through it, just like in the poor flatworm one. Maybe not the poor flatworm. They were thin enough that they could use diffusion. Now down below, what I've got is a schematic of how how a bird breathes. All right, we're going to move from the top to the bottom, and inspiration is going to be when the bird inhales, and expiration the opposite. The lungs are in the middle. They're the grill-looking thing, and the anterior and the posterior air sacs, there's the anterior, are indicated by these bulbs or circles, right? So we're going to follow one breath in of air, the one in the red. So the bird breathes in, all right? Now don't worry about what's happening in the other areas. Just concentrate on that's in the red right now. So the bird breathes in. The air does not go into the lungs. It goes into the posterior air sacs. Now the posterior air sacs allow things to be absorbed. So oxygen is being extracted. Gases are being exchanged. All right, the bird exhales. The air doesn't leave the bird yet. The bird now the air goes into the lungs. In the lungs, more oxygen is extracted, more gas is exchanged. Okay, so we're really taking that oxygen and squeezing it as dry as we possibly can. Now, the bird inhales again, right? Inhale, exhale. The bird inhales again. Another glob of air goes to the posterior air sac, but we're following the one in the blue. It doesn't exit the body yet, right? What it does when that bird takes an inspiration, takes that second breath, that first breath goes into the anterior air sacs, gas exchange occurs. That's what the arrows are showing you. And then the bird exhales the second time and gets rid of that first breath of air, that red breath of air that became blue as we followed it through. Isn't that cool? How many of y'all knew that about how many? Did you guys know that's the way birds breathe? I mean, Philip, you said because they're more sensitive. Did you know why they were sensitive? Sometimes we just call birds rebreathers. It's awesome. It's one of my favorite evolutionary adaptations. Yeah. Yep. Most people know they're rebreathers, basically. Yeah. They get everything out of it that they possibly can. Everything. I mean, when they expire when they exhale that second time or that breath the second time, when it finally leaves, it's extracted as much oxygen out as they possibly can. I don't know what our rate is, but we don't get 100%. We only get until it reaches equilibrium, if you think about it, because oxygen diffuses freely across the lungs. So whatever's in the blood, that's how much in your lungs. There's typically going to be less, but you can't have any more than that. Can't diffuse above that. Only to equilibrium. This reminds me of Marshawn Lynch for the when he played for Seattle Seahawks, the beast mode, right? So birds came from a type of dinosaurs we call beast feet, the theropods. There's a theropod right in the middle, the little tiny picture. Theropods were, your Tyrannosaurus and those guys. I think that's one from the American Museum of Natural History, I believe. That's right. Among these were, of course, an old favorite of ours from a long time ago when we were talking about evolution is the Archaeopteryx. And if you look in the grid over here on the right, there's Archaeopteryx, which looked a little like a weird-looking chicken, I guess, right? Now, notice what I got right here. This is the oldest known bird, and I put it in red, that began to have those asymmetrical feathers. And does that mean it was flying like an albatross at this point? No, but it does mean it could probably fly short distances. It could do chicken distances, maybe a little bit further than that. And as again, we talked about weeks ago when we started this, wouldn't that be an advantage if you were being pursued by a predator? You get to a cliff and you can fly over it or fly off the end of the tree branch, whereas the predator doesn't want to drop to the ground or whatever, a non-flying predator. Notice the critters before them, though. So while the dinosaurs are diversifying, the birds are doing this too. It always seems to be kind of a misunderstanding that, again, it's Aristotelian, that you get these critters, then these critters. No, even the mammals, we'll talk about in just a second, even the mammals were evolving during this time. So while the dinosaurs evolving during the Cretaceous, these organisms are developing, these characteristics of birds at the same time. Like, for example, Archaeopteryx, if you remember from before, I'm going to come back to this slide, had those things kind of in between. It's what we call the transitional fossil form, right? Long tail, birds don't have tails. With many vertebrae, birds don't have that, they have tail feathers. A toothed beak, again, birds don't have teeth. Claws on their wings, not quite the same way that you see in birds today. And again, asymmetrical feathers. Maybe jump up on a branch right up next to the ginkgo. That's right, because they were around back then. Okay, so we start up in the top. Let's look at some of the, and there's been a lot more fossils that have been found along the way of these organisms. They're really filling this tree. It's fascinating. But on the left-hand side, we have Sinosauropteryx. All right, this one right here. Sinosauropteryx, what's significant about that, had short arms, remember, like the Tyrannosaurus did, and it was covered with thin filaments that may have provided insulation. Not feathers, right? Feathers didn't evolve to fly. Feathers evolved to stay warm. And of course, you can think very quickly about something else that could come out of a placoid that can keep you warm, which indeed does keep us warm, right? Velociraptor, the famous one from all the movies, which they made it a lot bigger than it really is. There's one of the claws of the Velociraptor. Had a swiveling wrist bone, which is something we find in modern birds necessary to get that twist that they need to create that negative pressure. Caudipteryx, which is down here in the lower right, interesting looking organism there, had symmetrical feathers. So it went away, or not went away, but it went upon or took off from Sinosauropteryx with the filaments and began to make feathers, but symmetrical feathers. So you got warmth, you got coloration, you got all those things. Maybe there's some protection, but you're not flying yet. It wasn't until Archaeopteryx that you started to get asymmetrical feathers. All right, and then birds began to fly. And for a while, birds were increasing in diversification. The fossil record is full of a lot of birds that are toothed, for one thing, which is interesting because from the reptiles. But they're full of a lot of birds that have really big breastbones. And we know big breastbones, large bones in an organism are for anchorage of large muscles. That's what bones do. They provide an anchorage for muscles. So when we look up a fossil and we notice that it has a really large breastbone, we assume it had a very large chest muscle. And you would need that in an organism that was learning to fly. We can follow that in the fossil record as that bone got bigger. Now, it's interesting to me how sometimes, and I've mentioned this a million times, the slightest little change. You notice in the lower left, I'm showing you some of the evolution of the birds, and then we're moving along. And then all of a sudden, where I put the red arrow, boom, the evolution, the diversity of birds just took off. and it was because of something relatively small. It's something that we call an alula. An alula is a feather. Modern birds have it. It's right here. I've heard it, referred to it's like where the thumb would be, basically. It's a small, little, tiny feather. And what birds do with the alula is the same thing that modern aircraft do with slats and flaps, right? When the plane is landing or taking off, they're going slow, so they need more lift. They extend the wing. But when they get flying in the air, that extended wing is creating a lot of drag and friction, so they pull it back in. That's what an alula does for birds. So when birds learn the ability to not only engage in sustained flight, but controlled slow speed flight, then they become as maneuverable as a modern aircraft, don't they? That little tiny feather, the alula. I think that's a cool name. Yeah, but the carbon dioxide level builds up in your blood. Philip, you breathe. The reason you breathe is not because you need oxygen. It's because carbon dioxide level in your blood begins to build up, which makes carbonic acid, which messes up the pH. And they have these little receptors in your neck. What the heck are those called again? And it senses the pH. And it tells your brain, gotta breathe. That's why you can't hold your breath and die. Your kids tick you off. I'll hold my breath till I die. I'm like, knock yourself out. You would extract as much oxygen as you possibly could. Yeah, no doubt. That's exactly right. But gotta breathe sometime. There are 28 orders of living birds. Sure, no problem. There are 28 orders of living birds. As I said, this is an extremely diverse group. I'm only going to point out a few of them. For no other reason other than I think they're kind of cool. The really big group, the ratites, the what's with the words today? Struthioniformes are flightless birds. Going back to that breastbone again, on the sternum of these birds, they don't have a keel. A keel is a reinforced part. Birds that fly, not only do they have a big breastbone, these guys have big breastbones, they're big critters, right? But they don't have that reinforced part, which we find indicative of birds that fly, where you got to have a really strong muscle attached to a big bone that's reinforced, okay? So it's one that, this is the most ancient of all the orders out there, the ostrich, the rhea, the emu, and the kiwi. Another example, by the way, of continental drift. All these birds, South America, Africa, and Australia, look very similar to one another, and the reason why is we think that the ancestor one time kind of occupied an area, that when it was more closer together, somewhere around here, and then kind of just drifted off. Kind of when we were talking about the lungfish the other day. Oh, the penguins. I like penguins. I think they're cool. They're flightless too, of course, but they do fly in the water. The Spensiformes. And they're interesting critters. They walk and walk and walk, and sometimes they slide on their belly, but they don't fly. You have to wonder, maybe that's what it was. Maybe they just weren't trying hard enough. Wouldn't that be too bad? My God, if we just would have flapped them, we could have flown that 70 miles that we did on the there on the South Pole. The big group of birds, though, that everybody is, if you name a bird off the top of your cardinal and all that sort of stuff, are going to be the ones that came around about midway through the dinosaur era that we know as the Passeriformes. That makes up more than half of the birds. These are what we call the perching or the songbirds. Songbirds because they do the singing. But the perching is interesting. If you look at that picture down below, members of this group have a rear-facing digit called an hallux. And that's how they're able to grab and perch onto things. That's the big group. Passeriformes. Remember the penguin house at SeaWorld? Gah, just stunk all the time. These things just make the most ammonia-scented droppings. A cardinal, right? The male one, because it's brightly colored, not to be confused with the Catholic type. The red-shouldered hawk and the red-tailed hawk. The red-tailed hawk on the right, very obvious. Red-shouldered hawk is the, wish I could do bird calls, but even, rah, rah, rah. That's awful, I know. But that's the one that does that. These two birds in the middle are good examples of what we call sexual dimorphism. These are both grackles. The male is the one on the bottom, and the female is like the cardinals. The female is the one up above, but people oftentimes think of them as two different species. Laughing gulls, the ones that wake you up when you're trying to sleep at the beach. The scientific name of mockingbirds is, I've always loved that. It's Mimus polyglottis, the many-throated one. And then there's the blue jay, not to be confused with the baseball player, and also then the scrub jay. In Florida, we have a scrub jay. I saw one the other day out the Wekiva woods. I was out there. It was a couple months ago. Hadn't seen one in a while. They're a threatened species, protected by the United States government. It has a lot to do again with habitat destruction. Most of the times extinctions are caused by that. They're caused by the destruction of habitat. And most scrub jays require a habitat very similar to what most of Lake County used to be. Lake County used to be covered by a lot of stuff called the sandpine scrub type of ecosystems. And a lot of that, the sandpine scrub ecosystem is nice and flat with few trees, relatively flat. But it's great for making houses on too and big developments. So fortunately, their habitat was gone. It isn't always habitat though. Sometimes you're just a dodo. Poor dodos. They got that name innocently, right? Or at least that name got its bad connotation from these guys engaging in innocent behavior. They lived on the island of Mauritius, and in 1598, the Europeans began to colonize Mauritius out in the Indian Ocean, and there was this big flightless bird that lived on the island there. Oftentimes birds on islands become flightless because ain't no place to go, right? So why fly? Flying is expensive. So it was a big bird with a big, breast meat there, obviously, and within less than 100 years, because the dodos had no fear of humans, they went right up to the Europeans, and the Europeans went, wow, big chicken! Cut its head off and ate it. Dodos were extinct in less than 100 years, so I guess that's where we got the negative connotation of what it is to be a dodo. But again, it was kind of just innocent. The same thing happened on Guam when the cats and the snakes got introduced to the island of Guam, the brown snakes. They just destroyed the Guam's population of flightless birds, we call the rails. Certain types of birds are called the rails. The flightless birds, they nest in the ground, and the cats and the snakes just did a number on them. Flightless is good if nobody comes to visit you, right? I don't do myself, but everybody wants a piece of paradise. Okay, now we move on to the type of organisms that, when it comes right down to it, differed based on skull. All right. Remember we talked about the different types of skulls. There was the big, heavy skull of the sea turtles, which was over here. Then we had the diapsid skull, which was the lighter skull of the reptiles, and we found that really becomes pronounced in the birds. The lighting of the skull, the light in the bones. Birds have those air spaces in the bones, just like the tracheal air sacs in the insects, by the way. So a common thing, very convergent evolution thing. And the synapsid reptiles, or the synapsid line, is going to eventually give rise to the mammals. And when I say eventually, I really mean eventually. This right here is probably, Aristotle, if we're alive today, he might say, see, I told you, but nonetheless, it's maybe as close to a ladder as you can possibly think about. This is the synapsid side of that group that gave rise to the reptiles. Okay, so what were synapsid? Were they reptiles? Or were they mammals? Well, they weren't any of those things. They were kind of a group of critters that existed that don't exist anymore. They were the intermediate ones. Dimetrodon, the one with the sail, I mentioned that the other day. We always thought as kids, that's a dinosaur, right? That's not a dinosaur at all. That's a mammal-like reptile, or a non-mammalian synapsid. Synapsids are mammals, okay? So it's kind of like being the non-vertebrate vertebrates. Remember when we talked about those? Only when you get to the very end, right after that really weird-looking miniature, nasty-looking zebra-looking thing, the cynodont, do we get the three mammal groups, the monotremes, the marsupials, and then, of course, the big group of the placental mammals. So it was a very sort of a gradual sort of shift between all these types of critters here that were, more reptile down here and less reptile, more mammal up here. You could probably teach a whole class just on that one branch of the chain right there. But what does it mean to be a mammal? Well, for one thing, it means there's not a lot of us because they're relatively specialized. Only about 5,000 species, and most of them are the little ones. They've been around even since the time of the dinosaur, because that was a very effective way to survive in the time of the dinosaurs when they were chasing you around. But it's all about the hair for us. All mammals have hair, at least at some time in their life. Even the killer whale that you see there that is clearly nursing on its mom has hair. They have the little rostral hairs right around their nose, which they lose eventually because hair, like swimmers know, is not good for swimming in the water with. They use it for things like, obviously, warmth, insulation, camouflage. There's a picture of the tiger moving through the woods. It's pretty effective, isn't it? Especially if it was moving off in the distance and the wind was blowing and you wouldn't be able to tell where the stripes of the tiger ended and the weeds of the grass, you know. Sensory structures, you know, there's Cooper up there taking a nap. He can use his whiskers to, if I want them to touch one of his whiskers, he would obviously wake up. And the porcupine, man, they did some really cool. The porcupine cannot throw their quills, by the way. They just basically let you be dumb enough to come up and touch them, and they stick into you. Hardest thing about removing the quills, that people don't understand, is you have to cut the quill first because it causes it to shrink. It's easier to pull out that way. But warm-blooded, four-chambered heart. We no longer breathe, we breathe with a diaphragm. We breathe in our chest. We're very good thoracic. Remember, the amphibians were gulp breathers, buccal breathers. We're the big thoracic breathers. So we can get a lot of oxygen in. So we're kind of, if you think about it, it wasn't the birds and then the mammals. It was more like from the reptiles, and that group became the bird and these really two specialized mammal offshoots. Reptile offshoots. But the birds weren't really a reptile offshoot. They were a very specialized group of reptiles, and then a very specialized group of reptiles that eventually became the mammals. These guys that give birth to live young, although not all of them do that, have a placenta, and for the most part, a little smarter than anything else, right? We also are known for nursing our young, like that heart seal down below where the milk is 50% fat, causing the pup to gain, 5 pounds a day. Animals are weaned in 12 days. Talk about a harsh habitat, right? Junior, you got to get going quick because there are things out there that's going to eat you really fast if you don't. It's like drinking butter milk. What is regular milk? 5%. The skim milk is 2%. So if you think about it from there. Mammals are known for we're known for our teeth. We're known for our specialized teeth. If you look on the right, there are those critters that have teeth that grind, and those that rip, and those that chisel, and those that do a little of both, like us, depending on what kind of life you live. If you live a herbivorous life like the deer, you're going to stick with the chiseling and the grinding. You're not going to worry about, you're not ripping things too much. The beaver is going to use those chiseling teeth less for feeding, obviously, than for cutting down trees and making what the heck do you call where a beaver lives? They live in a beaver dam, but there's some special name for it, I thought. Many creatures like ourselves have a mixture of teeth. We have the front chiseling teeth, we're ripping teeth, and the grinding teeth, and that would be something that you might see in an omnivorous critter. Or if you're like a dog, you might have those teeth, but specialized for different things. Where in the middle of the chiseling is how they would remove the bone, yes, thank you, Philip. They would remove the meat off of the bone, and the canines. Oh, those are great, man. Canines right around the neck of the critter. Speaking about a big cat. I know this is a dog, but they use those canines that clamp around the prey. Wonderful adaptations. And then grinding teeth, But that's because we have a diversity of lifestyles that these critters live. There are herbivorous ones and carnivorous ones and omnivorous ones. And those that are herbivorous because they have mutualistic bacteria, which expands the range of what they can eat. That's how Bessie the cow does it. She can't eat cellulose any more than we can, but she's got bacteria that helps her do that. They have these not weird, but very cool adaptations, allow them to live in different habitats and do different things. These things called hooves and horns and antlers and the hoof of a horse. If you look up at the top, this is a horse's hoof. If you ever wanted where that is, if you look at the end of your finger, and then you were to curve your fingernail around your your finger, and make it thick, that would be what a hoof would look like. So this is like the end of the horse's finger. Horses only have one toe bone. That's it. The other ones are small little splints. And then the hoof is the thickening of the nail. Very effective for protecting an organism that only has one toe bone, but lives and dies by running. Organisms that live and die by running are generally thin legs, big body. Lots of muscles up top, move them really thin legs really fast. Horns and antlers, the difference is whether they're surrounded by keratin or not, horns or not. Horns, it's the velvet that we all know about, that you can see in that picture, that provides the nutrients for the growing bone, but that is replaced. What are horns and bones often used for? Protection. Of course, in the case of the cervids and the deers with the antlers, many times that's going to be combat. Male combat, because there's sexual selection, like we talked about back in evolution. There are flying mammals, right? Oh man, I remember I was out in the ship one time in the Navy, and we were in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We come up on a bunch of garbage. There's tons of garbage floating around the ocean, unfortunately. And there was a bunch of old pallets floating in amongst the garbage, and I remember a cooler was floating out there. But there was something scurrying around in these pallets, and we got closer with a bunch of rats. And my God, we must have been 1,500, 2,000 miles out to sea. They had, somehow gotten on there from somewhere. And rats are really good at, that's how they moved up throughout the world. They're very good at rafting for long periods of times and dealing with that. So rats are, really you give the hats off for being the craftiest, but when it comes right down to it, probably some of the neatest are the bats, though, right? The only mammals that fly, flying squirrels and stuff, glide using that patagium, that membrane. See right there in the picture, like I showed you in class. You can even see it in the picture of the Brazilian free-tailed bat. You can see the membrane between it. That's what allows them to fly. And yes, it is blind as a bat because they use echolocation. Very effective. Very effective for navigating in the dark. So I guess if we think about the mammals, one of the things, and I know this is true in every species, but the diversity of mammals, the different types of mammals, is really kind of interesting. So let's go back a little bit and step for just a second, step back a little bit and go back to evolution with the mammals. So the mammals start off as this mammal-like reptile, which looks an awful lot like a rat or a mouse, and it had these hair-like things, which were probably those filaments. They didn't become feathers in this case, but as I said, right, you can do two things with those. The synapsids are the mammals of today. That's who the synapsids are. There were another group of synapsids a long time ago, but they went extinct. Those are the ones I was telling you about in the list. That's why, where did the mammals and the reptiles separate? It's not particularly clear. So the mammals around, even during the time of the dinosaurs, 200 million years ago. Dinosaurs started 250 million years ago. Very early on, all the three groups of dinosaurs, the ones that lay eggs, the marsupials and us, took off. By the early Cretaceous, about halfway through the dinosaurs, a lot of adaptive radiation after the dinosaurs, right? We wouldn't be around if the dinosaurs hadn't got extinct the way they did. That opened up a whole bunch of spaces for organisms that previously, like that little one in the picture, it's a cool little critter. That's a artist rendition of some mammal-like reptile back then. But they were shrew-like, or maybe some early mammal too. Small shrew-like, ate insects, lived in the trees. They were nocturnal. Again, that sort of detective. How do we know they were nocturnal? Big eye sockets. We look at the fossils. If you had big eyes, you probably hung around at night. But there were other ones of this group that were sort of, along the line, like Biomasuchus. There we go. That was a synapsid reptile. And this guy, I think, is really cool. Check this out. Proegnathes, a synapsid mammal. Right? So notice they're both synapsids, but one's a reptile and one's a mammal. So somewhere along that chain that I showed you, did we go from synapsid reptile to synapsid mammal? And remember, it all comes down to what kind of skull. A synapsid is a skull. All right, speaking of skull, here's another thing that mammals did. Mammals hear better than reptiles do, okay? Here's what it is, really cool little thing. If we look at a reptilian skull, like if you look up top there, you see, well, or at least a reptilian skull from evolution, from back in time in the fossil. We're going to focus on basically 3 bones. We're going to talk about the temporal, or I'm sorry, the squamosal, the one in purple, the quadrate, the one in green, and the articular, the one in orange. Now, in present day mammals, all they have is what we now call the stapes that we learned in school. You remember in school we learned the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. All mammals have is a stapes. All they have is an anvil. So they get that level of sound, of fidelity, if you think about it. Throughout evolutionary time, these synapsid reptiles, as they moved into synapsid mammals, the articulating, the quadrate and the articular of the jaw joint, which Sean, we were talking the other day, remember, about how snakes can expand their mouths around things, and that's why that loose joint that you see up above there would have been actually advantageous, right? But what has happened among the mammals who kind of got away from the gapping of the jaw, maybe, is those bones, the quadrate and the articular, have been moved to the inside of the skull, and they become the incus, right, and the malleus, the hammer, and the anvil. I'm sorry, the stapes is the stirrup. The hammer and the anvil of the inner ear of the mammal, thus increasing how well we can hear, thus increasing our ability to communicate, thus increasing us going beyond roars and those kinds of things that reptiles are known for. That's kind of like the anterior gill arches of some fish that eventually became the jaw. These are all kind of all fit under those fortuitous kinds of things that change, right? You got this gapping jaw, which helped back then, but some other critters said, what if I take that gapping jaw with those loose muscles and turn those into a better ear? What do I get? Well, I get a critter that hears better, and for some reason that's advantageous right now, at this time, right? This bone migration, by the way, is still very cool because in mammalian embryos, you can still follow it. It still moves from the joint of the jaw into the inner ear. It's like that old thing that I told you about, phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny, or ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which means if you study the way something develops, it'll show you its evolutionary history, which is not quite true, but it's still kind of interesting. Sometimes it does seem that way. Habitat destruction, bam, 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 mammals have taken in the shorts, especially in the last 15 million years, as humans begin to move off the scene. Oops, sorry. Didn't go back one. So what are the 3 groups? We have the monotremes. Those are the egg-laying, oviparous, milk-licking. They don't have well-developed nipples. They have a cloaca like the shark did. Amphibians have it. These are the most ancestral, probably the most bizarre of all the mammals. Probably the ones that I'm thinking about the Europeans when they came to Australia, New Guinea, and all that area must have thought, what the heck is that? Duck-billed platypus, the echidna. These are platypus eggs, not very big. See, and so the young lay on the mother and lick milk that kind of oozes from these glands. So there's no real developed nipple. The marsupials, I've heard the marsupials saying what they do is they make a half-baked embryo. They're viviparous, so they give birth to live young, but the young has a very short time to live off of the placenta. It's a very short-lived yolk placenta, like you see in that possum right there. And after that, they've got to move up into the marsupium, the pouch. That's where they get their name, in order to continue to survive. There's more sustenance up there as well. So they get started off with a little starter pack, and it's up to them to either, in the case of the possum, possums have these folds underneath them, and the joey to climb up and get inside of the marsupium to survive. So that's the best way to think about them. They're sort of they come up with like a half-baked embryo. Those that bake the embryo all the way through to get a full done are the placental mammals. They have a true placenta, much more fetal development, prior to birth, which is going to lead to success. So you see, we go with eggs, amniotic. Okay, we go with half-baked embryos, full-baked embryos. And these are the most extant of all the mammals. This has been very successful for the mammals, whether we're talking about those that went back to the sea, like the cetaceans, that lion that's moving there in that picture. My son was in Australia. I told him, "You see any platypus?" He goes, "Yeah, Dad. They're walking around all over the place." He goes, "No, they're all in the zoos." I'm like, oh, that's a shame. Those that lay eggs are known as the monotremes. Those that have a pouch are known as the marsupials. We only have one marsupial in North America, and that would be the opossum. A couple of other mammal groups, the Sirenia, the manatees. Sirenia, because of the name from the, was it a Greek mythology story about the sirens singing to the sailors to make them crash on the water? Wasn't that in Odysseus? And sirens were known as like mermaids. So I guess it was the Spanish when they first came over to the New World, looked at manatees swimming and thought they looked like mermaids. I'm thinking you probably have to see it quite a while if you thought manatee. But they ate them, had any problems eating them. No hind limbs, all right? So we get this idea that, and again, manatees are actually relatively closely related to the elephant up above. Same kind of lips, notice? Same kind of lips on an elephant's trunk as on a manatee's, manatee's lips. The lagomorphs, the rabbits, you know, they're everywhere. Everybody thinks they're cool, sweet little critters. I'll come back to this picture in a second, or this slide in a second, but they're not such... Oh, come on now. Not too far. Anytime now. Seems to want to skip a slide. See if I'll get in just a second. Let me catch up. Lagomorph, hind legs, longer than the front legs. Rodents. The thing about rodents is the teeth in the front continually grow. That's why rodents continually have to chew. That's why they're such big gnars. If they don't continually gnaw, the incisors don't stop growing, and they get so big they can't feed. So they can't help it. They want to gnaw on your stuff. That's why they do that. They have to. As primates, of course, we have the opposable digits, and that's what sets us apart. If you don't believe me, try a day without using your thumb. It's really difficult. Capybara, world's largest rodent. That's cool. Not to be confused with the wharf rats that see up calling up the ship lines. That remind there's the rabbits. They're not quite as nice as they think. My father took me to go see a movie when I was a kid. Night of the Lepus was about these huge rabbits that attacked the world and gave me nightmares. And my mother always, I just recall my mother saying, "Why would you take a kid to a movie like that?" He goes, "I don't know. I thought it was stupid. I thought he figured it was stupid too." But I was like 7. I was afraid of rabbits for a while. How weird. I got over it. Manatees with the paddle tail. Dugongs with a whale-shaped kind of tail found in Australia. They're relatives. And the Steller sea cow, there's a whale-shaped tail, which has gone extinct. And this little guy over here is called a pika. Pikas are related to rabbits. Of course, the carnivore group, I could talk about that forever. Some of my favorite, but there's a couple of groups I want to talk about for a second. The artiodactyls or cetartiodactyls, I haven't read there. The artiodactyls are like the deer. They're organisms with even numbers of toes. Now, I'll get to the porpoise in just a second. I'm going to go back. I'm going to go 2 slides back. So artiodactyls have even numbers of toes, like you see in the deer track there. Perissodactyls, the one at the top, have an odd number of toes. All right, so like horses, they have 1 toe. It's splints on the side. So I always remember those in opposite again. Perissodactyls, they don't have a pair. They have 1. Artiodactyls have a pair. There's probably better ways to remember things than try to remember reverse, but some things just, to me, just work better that way. What's interesting about artiodactyls is just recently there's been evidence to suggest that artiodactyls and cetaceans are relatively closely related. If you look at this chart here, it says that if we look at the even-toed ungulates, so those are the artiodactyls, 50 so million years ago, that cetaceans and even-toed ungulates shared an ancestor, and that wasn't that long ago. That was after the dinosaurs. Interesting enough, too, if you look, the cetaceans are closely related to hippopotamus, too. I thought this was a cool picture. Are cetaceans audiodactyls? I think the only people who would find it interesting would be probably nerd types, right? Cows and dolphins. The Chiroptera, which are the bats. You gotta always think about the bats. And of course, there's moles and shrews. A lot of times you walk outside, you see your grass torn up a little bit. Looks like a trail, or your dog goes crazy with the nose to the ground. It's because we do have shrews and moles that live here in Florida. Shrews and moles are about the same thing, actually. Speaking of bats, check this out. This is the world's largest bat, the giant golden-crowned flying fox in the Philippines. That girl's pretty gutsy for holding that thing. Look at that thing eating a banana. I guess a banana. Is that a kid? The one on the right? We have 13 species of bats in Florida. That's what those little houses you might see on the side of a tree sometimes. Those are bat houses. I love the one in the picture. Look, you can see the veins going through the wings and everything. It's amazing. I think that's the world's largest bat. It's like a flying dog. All right, we finish up with just a couple of slides talking about human evolution. If you'll switch for me, please. There we go. I'm not an anthropologist, so what I know about human evolution, I know basically from a biological level. I know that the evidence suggests, like every other species out there, we've evolved along in a branch, with some branches that exist. Well, only one branch today, the Homo sapiens, and many branches that don't exist, like Lucy over here on the right. We'll take a look at her in just a second. This is a branch of human-like critters that no longer are around, died somewhere in the vicinity of 2 million years ago. Homo sapiens would be the only ones around today, although there are other species that they find. Recently, Homo naledi is a new species that they found. They're not sure how that fits in with the evolution of organisms. If you want to get an idea of us and chimps and bonobo monkeys, we shared, if this tree is relatively accurate, an ancestor somewhere around 5.5 million years ago. You can see, once again, it's the same thing we talked about. We see large variations in things that tried, and people, hominids, whatever you want to call them, they were around for a while all together and then dying off, and just kind of, I wonder if it would be different if it had been more than just us. Like there would be maybe 3 or 4 hominids. I wonder how the world would be different if there were truly different species of humans. We can hardly handle the fact that there's different types of humans, let alone different species. This is Lucy. This is her fossil in the upper right, found in Ethiopia in 1974. Lucy lived about 3.2 million years ago. She wasn't ancestor of humans. There's a picture down below what we think she might have looked like. But she was a cousin of humans, kind of like a lobe-finned fish, when I told you that coelacanths were related to the line that gave rise to tetrapods, organisms with legs. Lucy was related. She's an Australopithecine. So that's a cool word. I love that word. I can say that word. Australopithecines are this branch off to the left. So us and the Australopithecines have shared a common ancestor just a little after us and the chimps and the bonobo monkeys did. So very distantly related. But one thing we know about Lucy, looking at her skeleton, is we can tell by the pelvis she walked upright. And those things, the Laetoli footprints, are actually fossilized, preserved footprints of African, of Australopithecine afarensis critters, organisms walking. And you can see quite clearly they're walking bipedal. We know that was a major evolutionary innovation in humans, and that had a lot to do with the environment, remember? So we finish up here at the very end, back on the same place where we started with environment. As it dried up, and these organisms came out of the trees and moved out into the open spaces. It made a lot of sense. If you look at this guy here, I assume that's a fella, a male. You tell he's looking off in the woods, right? Walking up on your hind legs will give you a traumatic advantage. But there's more than one way to skin a cat. Lots of other critters have adapted and lived out there longer than us and just as well as us, right? Remember, there's no goal to any of this. This could all change tomorrow. All right, guys, that's all I have. I'll stop right there. Let me finish the recording.